This is Judaism Unbound, episode 523, Jewish Psychedelic Journeys. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg, and Dan Liebenson is also here this week. Though, as we announced in last week's episode, Dan is sadly transitioning out of his role as co-host of the podcast. We are grateful to him for 10 amazing years of holding incredible conversations, while we are also overjoyed. We're energized to be welcoming Rini Yehuda Newman as new co-host. For more on this, check out last week's episode, that's episode 522. But know that while we made this announcement last week, Dan is still here for a couple weeks before Rini Yehuda will fully join me as co-host moving forward. We're excited today to host a conversation exploring a study called Jewish Journeys. It's a national survey on psychedelics that explores the attitudes, practices, and needs of the emerging Jewish psychedelic community in the United States. Our two featured guests for this episode have both been involved with this Jewish Journeys study. We're welcoming Zach Kamenetz, founder and CEO of the organization Shefa, who we first welcomed to the show back in episode 225, and Josh Lipson, a postdoctoral research fellow at Emory University. Before we dive into our conversation with them, a few quick Judaism Unboundments. First, this is the moment to sign up for Judaism Inbound, our Intro to Judaism course. It begins on February 25th, which, as we release this episode, is in just a few days. When the next episode drops, it will have already started, so now is the time to sign up. Financial aid is available, and in order to sign up, all you got to do is head to judaismunbound.com/classes. Judaism Inbound is designed both for students considering conversion to Judaism and for folks, Jewish and not Jewish, who aren't on a conversion journey, but for whom an intro to Judaism would be meaningful. So don't miss Judaism Inbound. We also have a number of other courses beginning in just a few weeks that we want to make sure that you're aware of. Again, financial aid is available for all of these as well, and judaismunbound.com/classes is still the place to go. We have Genesis, Peoplehood and Solidarity Embrace Sheet, that's the Hebrew name for Genesis, with Amanda Mbuvi, Magic and Medicine of the Psalms with Shefa Gold, Jews and Revolution on Socialists, Anarchists, and Radicals in the Modern World with Tony Michaels, and Everybody Beloved, A Jewish Embrace of Fatness with Minna Bromberg. For those who have already taken Judaism Inbound, we're also offering From Here to Ger, a course that helps you design the rituals to cap your conversion to Judaism. And now, Judaism Unboundments concluded, let's turn toward today's episode and tell you a bit more about our guests. Zach Kamenetz is the founder and CEO of the nonprofit Shefa, Jewish Psychedelic Support, which is an organization dedicated to creating spaces for healing, self-discovery, and community through the thoughtful integration of Jewish wisdom with psychedelic practices. Early in his career, he served in Jewish educational leadership roles, including as Director of Jewish Learning and Living at the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. In 2017, Zach Kamenetz participated in a joint psilocybin research study with Johns Hopkins University and NYU involving religious professionals, an experience that significantly shaped his vocational direction towards psychedelic-informed spiritual care. Zach Kamenetz is also trained in somatic psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy through the Hakomi Institute of California, and is a qualified instructor of mindfulness-based stress reduction. His work bridges theological reflection, embodied practice, and harm reduction-oriented support for Jews engaging with expanded states of consciousness. Zach Kamenetz lives in Berkeley, California, holds a bachelor's degree in Jewish Studies from the University of Maryland, and a master's in Biblical Languages and Literature from the University of California, Berkeley, with coursework at the Graduate Theological Union. He received rabbinic ordination from the Chief Rabbinical Authority of Jerusalem in 2012. Josh Lipson is a clinical psychologist and postdoctoral fellow at Emory University, where he researches psychedelics, spirituality, and the psychological aftermath of altered states of consciousness. He works at the intersection of psychology, religion, and culture, exploring how psychedelics and other consciousness-altering technologies interact with ritual, narrative, and ethical life. He's also a poet and essayist, and writes on Substack as Whitmanic, exploring mysticism, culture, deep history, and Jewish themes. He completed his psychology doctoral work at Columbia in 2025 and majored in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard. Zach Kamenetz, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. And Josh Lipson, welcome. It's so great to have you both.
Happy to be back.
Great to be here for the first time.
So today we're having the kind of conversation that I know Lex and I really love. I hope very much that our listeners also really love it. But it's really a very Judaism Unbound conversation because we're talking about data and we're talking about psychedelics. Those are two things that I think often people don't imagine go together. But like many things that people don't imagine going together well, like chocolate and peanut butter, it turns out that they're better together. So let's
I'm
have a little
obsessed
Reese's.
with this beginning. This is the greatest first question of all time. Dan, keep going.
So let's have a little Reese's Peanut Butter Cup conversation on this recent project that you're working on. So can we start by just explaining why you're doing this research?
So I founded Shefa in 2020. And through that process of starting to explore what it meant for supporting Jews who were working with psychedelics, I basically became the primary repository for the good, bad, and ugly stories of Jews working with these various medicines. And that was incredibly inspiring and deeply informed the direction that Shefa would take. And it also felt like a little bit of a black box for people who were not engaged or enthusiastic about psychedelics, namely potential funders, potential partners, and even potential leadership, that I couldn't just give these anecdotal stories in a really clear, concise way. Over time, and thanks also to Rabbi Josh Feigelson for the idea, I had this desire to really capture some of the data that I already knew existed in the field and to be able to share the story of Jews and psychedelics, at least in this country. So I approached Common Era, which is the research and development wing of the Jim Joseph Foundation. And I said, this is something that's really happening that is beneath all of us. It's happening everywhere. People don't talk about it. But I think it's a huge motivating factor in American Judaism, maybe since the 60s.
You mean undergirding all, like beneath, not like lower than us, but
No,
undergirding.
No, undergirding. It is
Great.
the understory of American Judaism. And so with their support, I found a really amazing, completely aligned research facility and researchers to undertake this bold experiment in starting to capture the attitudes, the practices, and the needs of American Jews with regards to psychedelics. The first research study of its kind called Jewish Journeys. And so now we're getting very close to finally releasing the findings and the data and sharing it with our community at large.
Jewish Journeys ended up reaching over 1,100 American Jewish participants from a wide range of walks of Jewish life, ethnically varied, socioeconomically, and especially varied in terms of level of Jewish engagement, denominational affiliation, ranging from just Jewish and very progressive Jewish denominations to Orthodox, even Hasidic. And we asked a wide range of questions about both attitudes toward psychedelics and practices around the use of psychedelics. And it's important to draw that distinction because not every participant in this study is actually a psychedelic user. Something on the order of 7/8, almost 90% of participants who we ended up reaching have had a psychedelic experience.
But can I ask you a quick question about that? Because I was struck by that number, and I'm just wondering about the research design. Were you trying to find a representative sample of Jews in America, and then you found that most of them have used psychedelics? Or you had a different way of finding the people? And like, why? I guess if so, then my question is, why were there any non-users in the study at all?
That's a great question. What I would say is one of the most challenging things about doing real-world research on people's use of psychedelics, which is sort of my specialty and my favorite kind of psychedelic research, whether it involves the Jewish community or not, is that when you go out there to recruit participants, invariably, people who've used psychedelics and who have things to say about their use of psychedelics are going to be way overrepresented. I actually don't think that this study makes any claims or gives us any obvious hints about what share of Jews in America have tried psychedelics. We have reason to suspect, based on many different things, that it's probably higher than the general population. And there are more and more good epidemiological estimates of general population use of psychedelics. But no, we're not claiming that 88 or 90% of American Jews have taken psychedelics. We were interested in trying to capture those who were interested enough to still say, hey, I want to talk to you about psychedelics and potentially the intersection of psychedelics and Jewish identity, even if they hadn't taken psychedelics. And I'll just note that in the minority of respondents who hadn't taken psychedelics but still came to us to take the survey, more than half of those were interested in eventually taking psychedelics one day. But we actually have participants in this study who came to us, haven't tried psychedelics, and said in no uncertain terms, I don't have any intention of taking psychedelics anytime in the future, but nevertheless wanted to offer their perspectives.
That sounds very Jewish.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yes. I have a question that boils down to two words. I've asked it of various different folks, and I mean it multiple ways. Who cares? So there's two different ways that could be heard, and I don't mean either of them offensively. I get that when people say, who cares in the world, it is often a dismissive remark. I don't mean it that way. There are two elements. One is, who cares in the colloquial sense? Like, why does this matter? What is the purpose of taking on a study like this? I'm actually not even yet really talking about its findings, although I really do want to talk about those. Who cares? Why is it important to take this study on at all? Why does this matter in our moment to explore the intersection of Jewish experience and psychedelics? And the other question is literally, what groups of people care about this? Jews could be an answer to that. I happen to know because I was at a wonderful talk at the American Academy of Religion conference that Jewish Journeys was part of, that this is actually not only a Jewish-focused conversation, that this is part of exploring psychedelics across multiple religious traditions. So that's part of what I'm getting at. But within Jewish groups, beyond Judaism, who specifically cares? And then again, why does this matter?
I would say I have two main audiences for who cares. The first is our organization. This is a relatively new public way that Jews are identifying, seeing this as part of their spiritual practice, how and why they gather. And it's important for us as a relatively young organization to know exactly where we should be moving strategically in terms of programming, resources, and the kinds of support that people need at this moment. So we want to get the widest picture possible from, as Josh said, the just Jewish to the Haredi, and to be able to think really thoughtfully about where we are moving the organization in the future. The second audience that I think is the who cares should be the wider population of psychedelic researchers and also clinicians, people who are going to start integrating this into their practice if they aren't already with things like ketamine or even underground with MDMA and mushrooms, that there are particular Jewish concerns that we might call culturally responsive needs of Jews in psychedelic space that we want them to understand, these researchers and clinicians, how to best support their Jewish patients or the Jewish subjects in research studies to have the best possible outcomes because of their engagement with psychedelic medicine.
In terms of the why does it matter side of that, I could speak from many different angles as a researcher, as a psychologist, as a Jew, as someone who personally cares about psychedelics. But I suppose what I would say is we've gotten to a point in the psychedelic research world where we have a pretty robust sense of what psychedelics can do, their effects in the moment, and the transformation that they can bring to people under controlled clinical conditions. But the bigger question is, how do we understand the effects psychedelics are having in communities and in the context of people who belong to a living spiritual and religious tradition? That's work that's only just beginning, as I think research over the last few decades has started from a posture of trying to control for all these factors, the messiness of someone's particular spiritual struggle, the messiness of somebody's lived communal religious experience. What's amazing about this study, and I think why we should really care, is that we're beginning to open up the question of how do psychedelics show up in the midst of a life that's already marked by experience, by identity. And as has been hinted at already, this isn't the only project in this vein that's being launched out of our center at Emory as part of the broader Mosaic initiative, but it is pretty remarkable that Jewish Journeys is the first out of the gate, the first comprehensive, large-scale study of psychedelic use and attitudes towards psychedelics in any modern American religious community.
Yeah, so I do think now is the time to start to get into some of the juiciness of what this study has found. And for folks listening, we will put all the relevant links in our show notes so that you can actually look at some of, to the extent numbers come up, you can be following along. It can be hard when there's random percentages flying and you're not able to remember all of them. So head to our show notes section of the website. But I don't want to start with the beginning of the findings. I was really struck by a closing bit of information that you shared, or maybe not information, but a closing conversation of the findings, which is around the word integration. The question that you were asking is sort of, to what degree do these folks feel a desire to have their psychedelic practices and their Jewish practices feel intertwined? And to what degree don't they? As I read what you found, it seems that you are articulating this notion that there's a shift underway maybe where earlier generations of psychedelic users may not have been looking for their psychedelic experiences to be Jewish experiences, quote unquote. And today, and I'm not speaking across the board about every person of every age, but there seems to be a trend where people that are younger generations may actually want to see their experiences with psilocybin or MDMA or LSD or the different medicines you're talking about as Jewish experiences. And that question was really interesting to me, both because it's like, what do we all mean when we say they would be Jewish experiences or not? But I guess I'm curious if you can take us into that question around integration of sort of, for me, the two realms might be, quote unquote, Jews who do psychedelics on the one hand, that's like the not integrated side, versus like psychedelic Judaism on the other.
What I'll say is that what we found, and we're parsing the data in different ways for different audiences, but what we found is that on average, whether we're talking about more affiliated or relatively lightly affiliated Jews, there seems to be a broad-based curiosity about bringing more of a Jewish framework to bear on psychedelic experiences. Numbers support this, and not to the exclusion of other frameworks like non-Jewish spiritual frameworks or therapeutic frameworks. This is a robust signal we keep seeing where there may be a difference between more affiliated and less affiliated Jews is in how clear a vision that already is. So what we see in the data for the 30%, let's say, of our participants who are more robustly affiliated with Jewish community practices, religious attendance, is an interest demonstrated in the numbers in incorporating more Jewish ritual into psychedelic experience, or naming an explicitly Jewish container around psychedelic experience. It seems like for the 70%, which again, we're talking about a supermajority in this sample, who are more lightly affiliated, there's a broad-based curiosity about bringing Jewish identity into the mix. But when you ask about particulars, is prayer part of your vision for future psychedelic experiences? Do you want your future psychedelic experiences to be linked to the Jewish ritual calendar? There's a bit more ambivalence. But what I also just wanted to emphasize again is that one of the interesting trends here, you already named it, Lex. Yes, there seems to be a shift from 60s, 70s wave of lots of Jews taking psychedelics, but not in most cases pursuing a Jewish lens on those experiences, to now the emergence of something you could call psychedelic Judaism, not a denomination, maybe not even a movement, but a field of exploration. Something related to this is that a lot of that psychedelic Judaism is not exclusivist. It coexists with what we in the research approach to this study call xenosophia. So a lot of psychedelic Jews, whether they're just Jewish or relatively religiously observant, are interested in a more Jewish lens and more Jewish container for psychedelic experience, but not to the exclusion of indigenous practices, indigenous approaches to sense making around the mystical. So a more Jewish psychedelic experience may not necessarily mean a more exclusively Jewish approach to psychedelic experience.
I wonder if there are two factors that are converging for two different kinds of populations somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, there might be more thickly involved or engaged that Josh is calling the 30%, who have potentially interacted, had some engagement or encounter with some kind of psychedelic community, experience, containers, we're saying. And for whatever reason, they have found it to be potentially too universal, or that their particular identity can't be identified or honored. There might be particular practices or assumptions in those spaces that a Jewish person might not share. And that might then lead them to say, well, what else could be possible that I would be interested in engaging that would actually honor, see me, validate me, and actually be able to express my unique identity? On the other hand, from, let's say, people who are in the 70%, I wonder, this is only a hypothesis, there may be concerns about cultural appropriation of indigenous or other cultures that seem to be part of these frameworks that exist in general psychedelic culture and experience. And there might be a kind of like a nervous or icky feeling that these are not my traditions. These are not being the traditions, the rituals, the practices, the words are not actually being held or expressed by the original cultural stewards of these things. And I'm not okay with this. So I wonder, so then that 70%er might say, I should maybe go back to the wells of my ancestors and see if there is something that is unique for me that I feel like I am in my own cultural integrity with without appropriating from somebody else. So maybe there is that midpoint there, but it might be other things. This is my hunch, though.
I definitely have a lot of prescriptive level questions for later, but I wanted to stay in the descriptive side for now and understand a little bit more about what you found in the study. So, for example, one of the pieces that struck me was this idea that I think you were saying you were finding this descriptively, that a lot of people were describing, let's say, a Jewish resonance of their psychedelic experience was that they were processing ancestral trauma in some way. That was an interesting descriptive finding. I'm interested in also your interpretation of the meaning of a finding like that, right? Because I suppose you could interpret something like that on different levels. If you believe that psychedelics is opening the doors to some kind of metaphysical experience, then you might say, well, that's interesting on that level. If you think of psychedelics as opening the doors to a physical experience, then, my question is kind of, does that suggest that these people are probably thinking a lot about ancestral trauma when they're not having a psychedelic experience, or it's on their mind, or it's somehow present for them so that when they have a psychedelic experience, it releases? Because I'm kind of wondering, like, well, if I don't think that I consciously think about ancestral trauma very much. So if I had a psychedelic experience, would I be likely to have an ancestral trauma related one? It seems unlikely to me. So I'm wondering kind of both what are some of the striking findings and also what might be the avenues to make meaning of them.
This is a really fascinating question. And we have emphasized this ancestral trauma piece in our analyses and in some of our presentations of the findings. And it's because it's so striking. And I like the point that you make that the story there really depends on our ontological assumptions about what psychedelics do. Are they actually connecting us to a non-physical realm? Or it's possible not to necessarily believe in non-physical realms, but believe in some sort of unconscious. There are some psychologists who don't believe in an unconscious, who might say that ancestral trauma is something that comes up here for mimetic reasons, because it's something that people are talking about out there. So I don't think we need to make any assumptions about which of those is the best model to get into the question of why ancestral trauma seems to keep coming up. What I will emphasize, just as a caveat, is as impressive a recurring finding this is in the data and in some of our interviews, in-depth interviews with a smaller subset of participants, this wasn't, say, one of the top 2 or 3 themes or top 2 or 3 reasons why people flocked to psychedelics in this sample. Really, what we saw as the most commonly cited motivations for taking psychedelics, at least, were more general ones like psychological and emotional insight into the self, spiritual exploration, having fun, connecting to other people. And then I believe ancestral trauma exploration was number 10. I think about a third of participants cited it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't people who went into an experience thinking they were going to have fun, or they were going to have general insight into their personal emotional functioning, and then encountered ancestral trauma along the way in ways that surprised them. But I personally wonder, and I'd be curious to hear Zach's take about how much of this owes to, say, the memory and retelling of the story of recent collective traumas that we've experienced as a people in only the last handful of generations, or, if you go back a few hundred years, you can include a lot more in that category too. Or if we're talking about something that goes even further back to the Jewish injunction for us to always remember the full cycle, recapitulate it in each of our minds in every generation, and how much that creates a sense of consciousness of our ancestors traveling around with us wherever we go, that could potentially be unlocked or brought into resonance by an experience with psychedelics.
I couldn't say it better than Josh about what is potentially going into this. And I think going back to the who cares of it, Lex, I think that this particular piece is relevant for our entire community, the Jewish community, interested in psychedelics or not, that this is a really potent conversation to have, regardless of the catalyst or the framework for this conversation, and even addressing it head on, that I think is just going to grow over time. It's acute in the psychedelic world. For example, there's an ongoing study, a huge study by Dr. Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai right now that is looking at intergenerational trauma and psilocybin specifically. Many of the people who have come to Shefa for integration support, the reason that they are coming through is because they have had unexpected surprise visions of either traumas that their families have experienced and have been told, or traumas that they have not directly carried. I think we should attend to this now. We have the luxury and the benefit of the time and the resources that our ancestors did not have to see what is here and what would it be like to be a Jew living in the 21st century that didn't mistake our personas and our cultures for our traumas.
I'm going to tell a brief story that might not be clear why I'm telling it to start, but I promise we're going somewhere. At my summer camp growing up, there was a little short mini story in our prayer book. It was a Jewish summer camp, and it became like a beloved little story of the camp. And it said, people go to synagogue for all sorts of reasons. My friend Garfinkel goes to talk to God. I go to talk to Garfinkel. Hearing that as a child was very, very important because I think it shone a light on how Judaism, for many people, It can be about connecting to divinity, connecting to spirituality. That's the like talk to God kinds of folks. It can also be about connecting to other people. And I had this moment looking at a slide you had that was talking about the reasons people took psychedelics. And I covered the top of the page. Maybe I'll put this visual in the show notes. I covered the top of the page, and I did a little test of myself to see how many of the reasons for taking psychedelics could be a common answer for practicing Judaism generally. And pretty much all of them were. And just to give some examples for folks. So I'm looking at the slide right now. The first one, I'd love this to be more of an answer for Judaism, but curiosity/adventure. That was the most common answer for why to take psychedelics. I think that would be kind of low on why people practice Judaism, to experience adventure. I would like in a better Jewish world for it to be much higher, but I think it's for some of us why we practice Judaism. Increased spiritual awareness was the next one. Fun was another one. Mental health, spiritual awakening/realization, intellectual/creative inspiration, social reasons, just social reasons with friends, self-insight, learning about oneself, general self-improvement, improve personal relationships, then the intergenerational ancestral trauma piece that you mentioned, improving health, it's part of my social or cultural identity, it's connected to my occupation, and the last one, it felt expected of me at the time. That was the lowest answer, but I actually love that you included that. There are some people in this study who the reason they took psychedelics is because of peer pressure, effectively. It felt expected of them. What can this teach us beyond psychedelics about why spiritual practice generally? Like, I think in many ways, what I love about this study is it's a model for how we might do this with any number of other things. Like, I'd love the study that asks 1,100 people why they pray, and includes some who don't, by the way, in the same way yours did. So take me into that slide a little of like, what are some of the reasons people experience psychedelics? And maybe if you can help me think through this way in which it parallels why we do Jewish generally.
That's a really interesting one. I mean, I appreciate you, first of all, naming just a few of the options, but nevertheless, that cover a huge part of the spectrum. First and foremost, if you add up all of those numbers, you obviously get a huge multiple of 1,100. So many people said multiple. And I think part of that is that people, it's interesting because not everything that is fun is necessarily coded by people as spiritually significant or potentially spiritually significant. Not everything that is an adventure is necessarily associated in people's minds with connection. Psychedelics have a strange way of evoking all these different resonances. But I think a lot of the time people are responding to a question like this retrospectively. And when they were thinking about taking a psychedelic, they didn't necessarily have a list of different reasons in their head. There was just a feeling that if you go back and analyze why did I have this feeling, you could ascribe these different things to it. So there's a lot of overlap, and someone's urge or decision to take psychedelics when you unspool it could sort of fit with a number of these different categories, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 of them at a time. But I do think you're right that very few people, but still, you named the category here, say that they did psychedelics because it was expected of them or because it was part of their occupation. This is a case where, yeah, I think other Jewish practices or Jewish affiliation, you might see these much higher up on the list. And so the question is, are psychedelics an agent for people to feel more of a sense of choice and adventure and agency in their Judaism, in their Jewish communal affiliation, versus just going through the motions? I mean, there's discourse around what psychedelics do on a brain level, on a psychological level, and people like to argue that so much of what psychedelics do could be reduced to or explained by wearing away at or softening usual patterns of connectivity in the brain, usual habits of thought, and allowing people to play in a space of more flexibility, play in a space where different parts of the brain connect to each other that usually don't, play in a state of heightened neuroplasticity, and see what shakes out on the other side. And perhaps a Judaism that's characterized less by, well, I was doing it because it's my job. Literally, I get paid by the Federation, so I have to keep doing Jewish stuff, and more toward a Jewish experience that is opted into, is elected, is sculpted to fit your actual emotional and psychological and spiritual needs. So I wonder if psychedelics are one of the promising forces out there today for nudging people in that direction.
Your question, Lex, reminds me of a quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel in Man is Not Alone, when he said, prayer is a risk. The idea that there being anything risky about prayer would be quite surprising in most of the contexts in which a lot of people pray right now. That's not my sense with psychedelic experience, either in group settings or individuals, even if it is with a therapist in the best possible setting in terms of ethical care or safety standards, etc. There is risk involved, and people assume that risk. Part of it is the potential encounter with the unknown, the numinous, the mystery of what will unfold during the journey. It could be, God forbid, a hell realm. It could be a chorus of angels. It could be, forgive the graphic language, but someone felt as though there were smokestacks from Auschwitz coming out of their bodies. That does not have a very clear one-to-one in the Jewish world of education, engagement, programming, and community, at least as far as I'm aware in most places at most times. It might be, in some ways, it might be an adjunct to where Judaism is falling short, and just for that reason that most people are reaching for this, because it does not have a parallel in the way that modern American Judaism lives today.
Well, it's interesting to talk about the risk because, and this goes to a little bit, I think, of what we talked about last time you were on, Zach, that, first of all, I think that almost everybody, I think, would probably agree that we don't want to, we can't, we shouldn't live a life that's all about risk all the time. Not too long ago, there was that Netflix show where Alex Honnold, the free solo climber, climbed up this enormously tall building. And I remember people talking about how his amygdala doesn't work the way that most people's do. Like if they scan him, they see that he actually has a lesser ability to experience fear than most people. And therefore, even he who's taking these enormous risks all the time doesn't feel like he is. It's not. So I'm not totally sure that I agree with Heschel's idea that prayer is risk, because if prayer is risk, then I don't know that we want to be praying so much. So I wonder if it's a little more subtle than that, right? Because on the other side, we don't want to have no risk. A lot of us who like that statement by Heschel are liking it in part because we reflect on our own Jewish practice and we say, wow, there's no risk in that. And so, of course, I'm not getting any reward. And so what I imagine psychedelics can do coming into this equation is say, hey, every once in a while, we're going to do something risky. And we're going to hope that that risk brings with it a concomitant reward. I think of the possibility of Jewish practice as somehow getting close, remembering, using that thing that we learned when we did that risky thing on all the other days when we're not placing ourselves at risk. And the reason why Jewish practice doesn't tend to work that way for most people most of the time is because they've never had that experience. Now, one of our previous guests, Ruby Namdar, who wrote this amazing novel about the Second Temple, and he talks about how there was a great loss when the Second Temple was destroyed. We lost this capacity to get close to God, or to the, even just the slaughter of animals. Like there's something really kind of dangerous there. And it's actually a loss to not have that anymore. And the rabbis came in and tried to replace it with words. And it actually isn't enough. It actually doesn't work. And what's interesting to me to think about is the possibility that what's introduced by psychedelics is a middle path that says we can have that high experience, that close experience to source. We can have that periodically, and then we can have a practice, a daily practice that is enriched by that notion that we kind of did have that primary experience with source. So I'm just curious how you reflect on all of that, and also whether your research is able to shed light on an idea like that, because my assumption is that most people aren't having quite that experience because it hasn't been incepted in them. Nobody suggested that this is possible, and so they aren't likely to report that on a descriptive survey. But the real question is, if you could reimagine and offer them an experience that is like this, how would they respond to it? And my guess is they would respond very positively, but I don't know if we can know that unless we try it, or can we from some of this kind of research?
I'm so glad that we have actually had this challenge for a very long time, and we have so many source traditions that get exactly at this question. And we're also in really good company. I think there are many traditional cultures that, through rites of passage or initiations, saw it as a value to put the young precepts or adepts through stressful situations, vision quests, fasting, dangerous situations, hunts, that allowed people to enter into new states of consciousness and then to be absorbed into the greater myth of that people or culture. So, this question actually comes up in a text, many traditions, but I think best stated by the Baal Shem Tov in one of the collections of his teachings, where he is describing this ancestral pattern called Ratzo Vashov, running and returning, the ebb and flow. It's found originally in the book of Ezekiel, where the angelic bodies are running and returning around this burning, electrified throne of God vision that Ezekiel is having. And what is this running and returning?
Don't think we forgot that your Anya Shiva class was called Ebb and Flow, by the way.
I wasn't going to say anything, but I will put a plug into going into the catalog and buying it. So the Baal Shem Tov says that one must serve the Creator with both Ratzo Vashov, the running forward and the retreat. Ratzo, what's Ratzo mean? Running. The burning desire to rise beyond all worlds in yearning for the infinite. Wow. And what's the Shov? The return, to draw the light downward into the world through action, speech, and thought. If a person ascends in Ratzo, but does not return in Shov, like, how Ram Dass would say, I just wanted to stay high. Whether it was meditation or it was LSD, I would always come back down. I just want to stay high with God. But the Baal Shem Tov says, no, if you stay there, their service is incomplete. If they remain only in Shov and only in the retreat without the fire of Ratzo, their service is lifeless. Here already is just the desire to run into these expanded states, into a direct confrontation, a direct engagement with the numinous, the mystery, as you said, Dan, the source. That feels like something that can contribute to the overall well-being of an individual. And we're even seeing other researchers who talk about these types of mystical experiences that have particular positive outcomes for mental health and well-being. Maybe we could turn the volume up on this pattern of being Jewish and human in the world right now.
What is so fascinating specifically about psychedelics as a vehicle for this, and this is not an endorsement of the use of psychedelics, it's just a descriptive claim, is when you once again look at the data on reported mystical type experience from psychedelics, the results are pretty comparable between more and less affiliated Jews. Fairly similar levels of mystical experience, holding equal the amount of times that they've voyaged with psychedelics. So the question of what people do in the shov, in the integration, in the sense-making, whether explicitly Jewish or not, is one thing, but it seems that psychedelics are a very robust catalyst of what Zach is calling the ratzo, however people are specifically framing it.
I really love risk. I think this is a great moment to check in on risk as a broad theme of our show. We don't always frame it that way, but Judaism unbound, right? Like Judaism without classic bounds or pushing beyond typical bounds. Like, what are bounds? What are fences? Like, they exist to safeguard against risk, generally. I mean, we could go through other purposes of boundaries, but typically, if you have a fence, if you have a boundary, if you have something at the edge of a territory, at the edge of a group, it is safety oriented. I am risk seeking. You were just talking about endorsement, non-endorsement. I don't know if I'm endorsing it or not. I will say I'm unendorsing a lack of risk. I do think that the tendency of religious life and religious institutions, but even not just institutions, is to err on the side of caution, to think about what happens if we don't have structure. What happens if we risk too much and therefore something we hold dear goes away or something we are afraid of becomes possible. All of that is true. And I say all this because I think psychedelics is one of many realms where people who feel drawn, I mean, not only to risk, but to wildness, to the potential for adventure. Again, that was the top response, right? For me, adventure is an exciting word. And I said it when I was making the parallel between these categories, these reasons for doing psychedelics and reasons for Judaism. I really believe that Judaism does provide scaffolding for adventure. I actually think it's a really good system to hang out in if you're looking for aliveness in the world. But when so much of our Jewish life is about sort of moderating people, keeping things safe so that you neither get mostly so you don't get an overly negative experience, but it also means you can't get the overly positive experience. Like if you use the thickest paintbrush and you make a mistake on the art piece, you've made a really big mistake. If you use the tiniest paintbrush, well, you can make a mistake because it's a tiny mistake and it won't be that visible. Judaism Unbound, I think, in many ways is out here for risk-seeking Jews, trying to create risky Judaisms. I flashed to a conversation we had with Shai Held, who is a wonderful teacher, but described himself as low-voltage Judaism. He was seeking and I realized in that conversation, oh, wow, I am high voltage. I need the charge, and sometimes the charge could electrocute me, but the charge could also charge me in a positive way. My sense from the two of you and from others involved in this work is that you are avoiding should statements around, hey, everyone, psychedelics is amazing and you should do it and it's going to be wonderful for the world. Like, you want to balance both the energy and the caution. But to some degree, I guess I'm wondering your meditations on risk and Jewish life with respect to psychedelics, but also beyond them, because I think this is one area of many where we are taught that to go into this realm is to teeter on the edge of a precipice that you could fall off and have deep damage. I'm wondering if there's also the other side of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just impressionistically, first of all, you're inspiring me, Lex. You're reminding me of the beauty of electricity and risk. When I've talked about just the general intersection of Jewish spirituality and psychedelics, and I'm certainly not the most learned in the texts, but I'm really, really fascinated by the corpus of texts and stories that came out of the Merkava mystics in the early first millennium CE. The story that has survived and gained the greatest currency out of that is the Pardes story. A lot of people tell that I love telling in the context of psychedelic risk-reward calculus. And for some background, this is the story of the four who entered paradise, the garden, the orchard. And it implies basically that in a sample size of 4, you have a 3 in 4 chance of electrocuting yourself one way or another. And what I've found interesting is that as someone who studies risk in the psychedelic world, both short-term risk, having a challenging, difficult experience, and the thornier question of longer-term risks, the literature has never suggested that there's a 3 in 4 chance that psychedelics will be very bad for you. On the contrary. So I've always found it interesting that this is a story that found its way into the rabbinic telling of why voyaging to those realms is so risky. I think with the intention, I could be wrong, of discouraging people from running after those realms too avidly. But that risk benefit ratio may be miscalibrated. It may be that psychedelics are not nearly as risky, or mystical experiences are not nearly as risky as the guardians and fence builders of our tradition might have thought or might have suggested out of an abundance of loving caution. But how risky psychedelics are in a Jewish context or otherwise is pretty hard to quantify, and I hope we'll be able to say more in the next few years for the sake of the wider public, both in terms of clinical applications and just people's freelance exploration.
Lex, when you were describing your desire for risk, the term that came up, which was given to me by my therapist, was existential kink.
Amen. Lexistential for me.
There's something about this life that needs to be intense, right? There needs to be intensity. And I think that what I'm learning through my own practice is becoming more aware and grateful for the subtle energies that exist all around that are actually quite nourishing, that I don't always have to default to the most extreme, risky piece of input possible. But with regards to risk and psychedelics, risk and Judaism, that beautiful text, that Ur text that Josh shared about the Arba Shenichnasu, the four that entered. I have another companion text from the Babylonian Talmud, Yoma 72b, where it basically says that Moses was the Jewish people's first drug dealer. And that drug was Torah, because the word in Hebrew for drug, sam, is also where you find, like, when you're singing in synagogue and you say, V'zot HaTorah asher sam Moshe, that this is the Torah that Moses drugged the people of Israel with. Moshe placed it before, but also drugged the Jewish people with. So the Gemara enters and says, like, well, what are we talking about here? What kind of drug is this? And they say that Torah, just like psychedelics, can be a drug of life and it can be a drug of death. One voice says it's all about merit, right? It's precocious in that way. If you merit, it becomes a drug of life. If you don't merit, it becomes a drug of death. But then lastly comes in Rava, one of these other later generations teachers. He said it is not about merit. It is about making a craft of it. If you make a craft of Torah, just like we might make a craft of breath work or fasting, of psychedelic work, then it can become a drug of life. But if you don't make a craft of it, if you're sloppy, you're not attentive to harm reduction, you're not attentive to ethical considerations or a person's background, ethnicity, their trauma profile, that is when people will start getting hurt. And so even though we're talking about this in largely glowing terms, the risk is not just the risk of changing the genders of the verses in the Torah from male to female and or having a genderless Torah. This is about people's psyches. This is about people's health and well-being at the most extreme, people in their most vulnerable states.
It's interesting. Nearly 2/3 of folks in this sample who have reported using psychedelics say that they've had at some point a challenging experience. And that does not necessarily mean an experience devoid of positive elements or that was on average unpleasant and bad, but nevertheless that met the criteria for challenging. And then 29% of folks in this sample who'd had a psychedelic experience reported having some sort of lasting difficulty or challenge from a psychedelic. That's not trivial, 29%. So that could span from something relatively mild to debilitating. That could be spiritual crisis. It could be somatic disturbance. It could be dramatic and unpleasant alterations in mood or thinking pattern. But it is worth emphasizing, we have evidence of the real embodied risk in these data already. And hopefully, again, we'll be able to report in more detail.
Yeah, and I really take that seriously. I mean, I'll say that despite my interest in it, as Zach knows, I have not had a psychedelic experience because I'm afraid. But the truth is that everything that you were saying earlier, Zach, I wish people said those things about Judaism. I wish people said, "Hey, Judaism is really kind of dangerous, because it can really help you, but not everybody's helped by it." Some people say that, and certainly people have been harmed by Judaism. But the truth is that I think that most people never really encounter Judaism deeply enough to be helped or harmed by it, including me, by the way. Because I think that for me, a lot of it is cognitive and a lot of it is imagining the possibility of a Judaism but not so much experiencing that powerful version of Judaism. And yet I wish that people imagined that Judaism could be that powerful. And that leads me to a sort of a comparison between Judaism and psychedelics. This is a layperson's view of psychology and understanding of psychology, so apologies, Josh. But, I think about the history of psychology over the last 20, 30 years as, right, that essentially the advent of positive psychology is that, classical psychology looked at the function of psychology as helping people overcome a problem. And positive psychology said yes. And also, that's leaving out a lot of the possibility of the power of psychology that we might have, because psychology could also help people be more joyous or more effective or more relational, not necessarily because they're suffering its absence, but because the presence of it could enrich them. And so if that's true of psychology, I think when people talk about psychedelics as a medicine, they're talking about that same thing, the possibility that it could help you overcome a problem and help you embrace or grow an opportunity. I wish that people would talk about Judaism that way. I'm wondering whether psychedelics and Judaism could sort of help one another, or whether that's really what the thing is that we're after here. So I'm wondering, for people who do psychedelics because they're using it as medicine, how could Judaism actually help make that experience better? How could Judaism be the thing that helps them follow on that get close to the source experience that we were talking about, so that it's not a one-time experience or every once in a while experience. It's something that facilitates their whole life. And in that sense, it's not psychedelic Judaism. It's what I think Judaism is here to do, which is to help us live better human lives. So that's one possibility. And the flip side of that is, if I'm somebody who is using Judaism in my life, which is what Judaism Unbound is about, trying to present a Judaism that's worth using in your life as opposed to just being Jewish, right? So if I'm that kind of person who wants to find a Judaism that works for my life, how could psychedelics help us imagine a version of Judaism that a person who up till now has been saying, "Hey, I'm not really finding a lot of value in Judaism," would be able to find that value? And maybe it is what I was saying earlier, this idea that Judaism actually doesn't work that well if you never have the primary experience. And so psychedelics helps Judaism be better by sort of imagining a version of Judaism where you do occasionally have a primary experience. So I guess I'm just sort of putting that out there to wonder, as we continue to do this research, like, where might that take us, either in reimagining Judaism or reimagining the way that Judaism could help people have better experiences with psychedelics.
Since the last time we talked, Dan, Shefa has moved into the direction of not just supporting people after they have had psychedelic experiences in various contexts, but we have actually moved into what we call, or at least what my lawyer calls, medicine touching spaces. We've been working with ketamine that is prescribed by a physician and that is being held in a one-day retreat setting. And we have also most recently moved into the legal framework of Oregon that has a statewide psilocybin legal framework, and also starting to explore that similar framework in Colorado. And what we're learning from bringing people, preparing, holding, and then helping people integrate in these small groups is exactly what you're describing. That based on looking at these texts, working with texts as maps of consciousness, as maps of reality that could help support us in our journeys. Into the ceremony space itself, where we're incorporating Jewish ritual as a way of helping hone our intentions, or even particular types of Jewish music at various parts of the ceremony, much like the indigenous practitioners that we work with are using. And then in the integration phase, when we're starting to sift between the dust and the gold of the experience to say, what's here? What could I apply? What could I change? What could be different or amplified? It is often Jewish ritual that is helping to support that irritation that people might have felt in that journey, whether it's archetypal, right? Starting to look, for example, one person just said, Adam wrestling with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. His whole body is working with this serpent energy. Wow, this is an opportunity to go deep, not only just in text study, but feeling that as a living myth inside one's body. Another person who reached out to me and said, I felt the light of Shabbat in a way that I had never experienced before. And now, very simply, very subtly, lighting Shabbat candles every Friday night is bringing them back to that originary experience in the journey that they had as well. I do feel like there is this way of doing really bold, creative ritual design that is directly applicable to one's direct experience, that Judaism could then enhance that experience and not have it kind of float and fly away, what often happens in a psychedelic experience. It kind of just like turns into smoke, and did it even happen? But we have these grounded patterns that could keep coming back in people's lives and seeing what is still there to unfold, and embracing the parts of our culture and our ritual lives that really speak to people.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Josh, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, guys.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As we close out, a couple reminders. First, Dan Lipson, our amazing founder and longtime co-host of this podcast, is transitioning out of that co-host role. And we are so grateful to him for his amazing 10 years, so much so that we want to send a ton of gratitude and celebration his way, where we mark all the amazing wisdom he's brought to us over the years. So we've made a form that you can fill out at bit.ly/DanUnbound, no spaces in that. And you can submit a piece of wisdom from the podcast that is memorable from Dan. You can say how he's touched your life over the years. If you took a class with him, you can talk about what that meant. Whatever you've got for the impact that Dan Lipson has had on your Judaism and your life, please submit that at bit.ly/DanUnbound. Also, stay tuned for an amazing celebration we're going to have in Zoom on March 8th. That's a Sunday. You can register for that by heading to our website and clicking the little banner at the top that says we're celebrating Dan. It'll get you the link. We are so grateful to you for coming and showering Dan with all the love that he definitely deserves as we have this transition in our podcast. Also, we have Unyeshiva courses on the way, specifically Judaism Inbound. Our Intro to Judaism course starts in just a few days. You can sign up for that at judaismunbound.com/classes, and there is financial aid available for anyone who needs it. We also have a bunch of amazing other Unyeshiva courses starting a little less soon, but you can learn about those and register as well at judaismunbound.com/classes. As we round things out, we are always deeply appreciative when you are in touch with us, so you can send your visions for the Jewish future, thoughts on psychedelics and Judaism, whatever you've got, in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com and lex@judaismunbound.com. Third, you can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, find show notes for this episode, all sorts of other juicy goodies, and this is less staying in touch with us and more supporting our work. We are so appreciative when you are able to send us a monetary donation, and you can do that by heading to judaismunbound.com/donate and making a gift on either a monthly recurring basis or just a one-time donation. So thank you all so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.